Hello, this is How To Bob, and I'm going to go through the steps on how to make a concrete countertop. Now, I chose concrete for its durability, water resistance, and heat resistance. So I started out with 3/4 inch melamine board, and I started out cutting a 1.5 inch strip. 1.5 is going to be the thickness of my countertop, and these strips will be used for the form the sidewall. Now I'm going to cut my countertop to the depth, and I want to add 3 inches. That's 1.5 inches on each side for the forms, and I just cut it to length. The nice thing about this melamine, it's got a smooth surface. It'll release the concrete very nicely, and it leaves a very smooth finish. So now that I have all my strips cut to length and depth, I can go ahead and assemble my form, and I want to mark the sides every 6 inches. That should hold the concrete once I go to pour, and you can see I just clamp that down in place and mark it every 6 inches. Once I get it marked, I'm going to be using a 2-inch drywall screw, so I'm going to pre-drill out my sides just so that it doesn't split my form, and I do that every 6 inches. Next, I'm going to countersink the holes, and I use a drill bit just the size of the head of the screw that I'm going to use, and I just slightly drill down in each one of the holes that I've got, just enough so that the head of the screw will be countersunk, as you can see here. And then I just repeat that for all the holes on this form. Now I can go ahead and put my screws in, and you can see that they're countersunk. That'll be nice later on when we're pouring the concrete. Now on this piece, I'm going to look at the sides and see which side's better. I want this side to be on the inside because it's going to give me a better finish. And I always want to look at that when I'm putting my forms together. Then I'll just go ahead and clamp it into place. Then I can pre-drill and countersink the holes every 6 inches for this side of the form. And once I'm finished with this side, I just repeat the process for the 2 remaining sides. Now that I've got my form all together, I want to wipe the corners out. I can use some alcohol, mineral spirits, some kind of solvent. I just want to make sure that it's good and clean. And I'm going to use a black silicone caulking. I'm going to use black so that I can see when I run the bead here, because this is going to be the edge profile of the top of my countertop. If you can imagine, this is upside down, so my finished surface is going to be face down on this. So I'll run a bead all the way down and around the entire perimeter, and then once I run the bead, I'll run my finger down to get a good radius. This radius is going to be the edge of the countertop. Okay, now it's time to put the sink in, and I've got my center line marked here and here. That's where my sink is going to go, and I use 1.5 foamular insulation. It matches up the depth of my form, so I mark the center line of the foamular, and I just want to center it in the form, front to back, and make sure it's perfectly centered. Once I get it centered, I can go ahead and put in my 2-inch screws to hold it in place, and I want to put those every 6 inches, and I could silicone around the edges to give it a nice clean finish, but if you're using a self-rimming sink, it's not necessary. You'll never see the finished side of the sink. You can also skip this step if you're doing a piece of countertop without a sink. Once my silicone has dried, my form is then complete, and I can mix my countertop concrete mix. Now I found a special mix made for countertops, and it works very well. So I want to mix that, and I want to add in any colorant to the mix. I used a little charcoal that made it a little darker than the concrete color itself, and you mix that to the manufacturer's recommendations, and you use a mixing wheel, mixing paddle with a high torque drill if you have one. It just makes it easier than mixing it with a stick, and it makes it more consistent. Makes it easier. I'm going to wipe out the form before I do anything else. Make sure any sawdust is off of my finished surface, any styrofoam pieces, and then before I pour, I'm going to run tape along the top edge. What that does is cover the screw heads so no concrete gets in there. So I can start putting my concrete in and smooth it around. Once I get about 3/4 inch, I'm going to go ahead and put my steel mesh into the area. I want to float that in there, and I'm going to work some concrete down in around the sink. I want to make sure that this is worked in real well, and once I get enough concrete in around the sink, I can lay a piece of, I use 3/8 rebar here, and I just lay it in. Once I get about 3/4 inch, maybe an inch of concrete, you want to make sure that the rebar and the mesh does not sink into the concrete, and it'll show up on the top, which is what we don't want. Then I can repeat the process on the other side of the countertop, and I want to work the rebar down just a little bit. I want to make sure it doesn't pop through with the top of the countertop, but I want to make sure that it is embedded in the concrete, and this will support any small areas or keep the concrete from cracking. Then I can use a trowel and work over top of the small areas. Again, I want to make sure that it's covered, the rebar is covered, and then I can screen the top of it off, which is actually the bottom. This just gives it a smooth surface to sit against the cabinets. Once I get that done, I'm going to use a palm sander, and what I do is just vibrate the concrete. I want to go around the whole form. This is a very important step, and what this does, it vibrates out all the air bubbles, makes the concrete more dense, and it gives a better finish. So the more time I spend vibrating the concrete, the better the finish will be, and it'll save me some time in the next step of grinding and polishing. So now it's time to take off the tape, and you can see that it comes off and leaves the screw heads fairly clean, makes it easier to come out. And I'm going to wait the recommended time before I take the form apart. Usually 36 hours is sufficient. Then I can take all the screws out of the form, and what I've found works very well is just use a rubber mallet and tap the form, and that breaks it free of the concrete. Then I can gently pull the form off the side of the concrete, and it comes off. It releases relatively easy, and you can see that there's the silicone on the melamine piece. So I just want to go back around the whole form and pull off my edges. Once I get that done, I can take out my screws that are holding my sink cut out, and I'm going to use a knife and cut my styrofoam. I'll just cut a little V shape in it, and then I'll use a putty knife once I get a V shape cut in here, just to pry out this little section here. I don't want to strain the parts of the countertop, and once I pop this little section out right here, the rest of it should come out fairly easy. Yep, there we go. Now I've got my countertop ready to set up and start polishing. So I'll use 2 people, and I'll flip the countertop over, and I'm going to wet sand with a diamond sander. And I don't want it to be too high speed because it'll burn up my diamond pads, but I'm going to progressively get to a finer and finer grit sandpaper, and I just keep going over the entire surface, keeping it wet. It's a very messy job, and it gets very wet, but I continue to work it over and over until I get the desired finish. Now once I've gone over it once, I want to start with my countertop concrete again, and what I'm going to do is mix up a real thin batch. You can see how thin the batch is that I mixed up. And what I'm going to do is take this slurry, and I put a glove on. What I'm going to do is smear it all over the top of the countertop, the edges, and what I'm doing is working this concrete slurry into any of the pinholes, air bubble holes that are left. And by doing this, it will fill in those holes. And that once the concrete has dried and hardened, I can go ahead and wipe off the surface with a dry rag and let it dry some more. You want to make sure that the concrete slurry is dried, so another day or two waiting for this concrete slurry to dry in the pinholes will help. So now that I've got that dried, I can go back with a fine 1000, 2000 grit diamond polishing pad and just go over the entire surface and give it a high gloss. Once I'm done polishing, all that's left to do is install the countertop on the cabinets and seal off the countertop with a food grade sealant, and that's how you make a concrete countertop. This is How To Bob. Thanks for watching.